A shattered security camera lens and a heavy silence were the only things left behind when an 84 Welcome to Ronan Cold Cases, where we dissect the forensic timelines and the psychological landscapes of the most baffling mysteries in modern criminal history. But the most chilling discovery was located at the front entry point of the residence. The security camera, specifically designed to act as a digital sentry and record any approaching threat, had been violently ripped down from its mounting bracket. The wiring hung exposed and the lens was obliterated. This was not a malfunction. This was a targeted strike against the only unblinking witness to the events of that night. And right there on the front porch, directly beneath the shattered remains of the digital security system, investigators found physical evidence of a violent altercation. The presence of this specific forensic evidence instantly mutated the entire nature of the investigation. It obliterated any lingering fragmented hope that she had simply suffered a medical event in the yard or had been the victim of a strange misunderstanding. The physical evidence of a violent altercation meant that terror had visited the front steps of the Catalina Foothills home. It meant that blood was spilled and a physical struggle had occurred in the dark. The sheer brutality of the scene juxtaposed against the vulnerability of an 84-year-old woman sent shockwaves through the responding law enforcement personnel. If you appreciate relentless, factual research into cases that demand answers, make sure to The Pima County Sheriff stood before the gathered press corps and delivered a statement that officially shifted the paradigm of the entire narrative. Looking directly into the cameras with a grim and unwavering expression, the sheriff declared coldly that they were no longer conducting a search and rescue operation for a wandering senior citizen. The sheriff stated definitively that the property was now an active crime scene and they were hunting a perpetrator. The realization that an intruder had systematically disabled the security apparatus, breached the rear entry, and engaged in a violent physical confrontation at the front door painted a picture of absolute horror. If you want to help us continue to bring these critical forensic timelines to light, please hit the like button so this case can reach a wider audience and perhaps reach someone who holds the missing piece of the puzzle. We rely on viewers like you to keep the pressure on these unresolved investigations. The physical destruction of the camera meant the suspected perpetrator was highly aware of modern. Subscribe and join our community of analytical thinkers as we unravel the truth piece by piece. Security measures and possess the forethought to blind the system before completing the extraction. The pried back door suggested a potential entry point, but the violent evidence on the front porch suggested a different location for the primary confrontation. Did she hear a noise and go to the front door only to be met by her attacker? Did the attacker enter through the rear and force her out the front? The contradicting entry and exit points created a complex tactical puzzle for the crime scene technicians. The fact that the physical evidence of a violent altercation was left exposed on the porch indicated that while the suspected perpetrator was organized enough to destroy the camera, they were either too rushed or too careless to sanitize the primary site of the struggle. This massive catastrophic event happened in the dead of night while the rest of the affluent neighborhood slept, soundly behind their own locked doors, completely unaware that a nightmare was unfolding just down the street. The sheer violence indicated by the scene demanded immediate and overwhelming resources because an 84-year, today we are looking at a case that shatters the illusion of suburban safety and proves that old woman without her heart medication who has already been subjected to a physical assault is living on borrowed time. The clock was not just ticking, it was slamming forward with terrifying speed. Every single second that ticked by reduced the statistical probability of a safe recovery. The isolated nature of the foothills meant the suspected perpetrator had a massive head start navigating the dark, winding roads long before the sun came up and long before anyone even knew a crime had been committed. The confirmation of a violent abduction triggered an absolutely massive mobilization of federal and local assets. The quiet driveway of the Catalina Foothills estate was rapidly transformed into a heavily fortified command post. The Federal Bureau of Investigation deployed their specialized evidence response teams, while the United States Border Patrol initiated aggressive sweeps of the surrounding rugged desert terrain. The proximity of Tucson to the international border added a layer of extreme urgency to the tactical response. Helicopters equipped with advanced thermal imaging technology methodically sliced through the cold winter air scanning. Sometimes the most impenetrable fortresses are merely cages waiting for a predator to turn the lock. The vast expanses of scrub brush and deep canyons for any heat signature that might indicate a human presence. On the ground, highly trained tracking dogs scoured the immediate perimeter, desperately trying to lock onto a scent trail leading away from the compromised property. Inside the mobile command center, the forensic analysis moved at a blistering pace. Rapid DNA testing confirmed the absolute worst fear of the family and the investigators. The physical evidence of the violent altercation found on the front porch was a definitive match to Nancy. This scientific confirmation removed any remaining ambiguity. She was bleeding and she was in the hands of a violent captor. The investigative strategy immediately fractured into two parallel and highly aggressive paths. The first path was the physical search, relying on grid patterns, aviation support, and ground teams. The second path was the invisible digital dragnet. FBI cyber technicians immediately began submitting urgent legal preservation requests to every major cellular provider in the region. We have to look at the meticulously preserved environment left behind to understand the true horror of what occurred. They needed a complete data dump of every single cell phone tower that covered the Catalina Foothills area between 9:50 on Saturday night and the moment the family arrived on Sunday morning. They were looking for an anomaly, a phone that did not belong in the neighborhood, a device that pinged near the house and then rapidly moved away down the dark arterial roads toward the highway. Simultaneously, investigators began frantically pulling data from every automated license plate reader scattered across the greater Tucson metropolitan area. They needed to identify every single vehicle that entered and exited the foothills during the critical threat window. But the digital investigation was akin to finding a needle in a massive dark haystack. The alleged perpetrators had operated in the deepest hours of the night when digital traffic is incredibly sparse. Furthermore, the extreme physical isolation of the property meant there were very few overlapping cell sectors, making precise triangulation nearly impossible. The sheer weight of the ticking clock pressed down on every single agent and deputy. The home was not tossed or ransacked in a chaotic frenzy indicative of a common burglary. The medical reality was inescapable. Without her specific daily pharmaceutical regimen, her heart was essentially a ticking time bomb. The kidnappers were not just holding a hostage, they were holding a woman whose biological systems were actively beginning to fail without her medication. The pressure to generate a viable lead was agonizing. As hours bled into days, the initial rush of the digital dragnet began to yield deeply frustrating results. The license plate readers captured hundreds of vehicles, but cross-referencing them against known criminal databases provided no immediate suspects. The cellular tower dumps were massive, but filtering out the noise of nearby highway, traffic, and random digital pings proved to be an incredibly slow and arduous process. The physical search teams pushing deep into the harsh Arizona wilderness found nothing but empty canyons and scattered animal tracks. The investigation was rapidly approaching a terrifying wall. The suspected perpetrator had seemingly executed a flawless extraction, leaving behind no usable digital footprints, no careless physical mistakes, and no obvious path of egress. Instead, the preservation of her mundane everyday items, her reading glasses, her keys, her wallet, speaks to a highly targeted operation. The silence of the desert seemed to have completely swallowed the 84-year-old woman and her captor. The command staff faced the grim reality that traditional investigative techniques were failing to crack the armor of this highly organized operation, but the FBI does not rely solely on traditional methods. Deep inside the regional forensic laboratory, a dedicated technician refused to accept that the violently destroyed Ring camera was a complete dead end. The suspected perpetrator had smashed the lens and ripped the wiring, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern cloud-based security architecture. While the physical hardware was utterly destroyed on the front porch, the internal memory components and the immediate data transmission logs were still intact within the shattered plastic housing. The technician painstakingly rebuilt the damaged circuitry, applying microscopic soldering techniques to bridge the severed connections. It was a painstaking, agonizing process of digital resurrection. And then after days of deafening silence and terrifying dead ends, a single fragmented packet of data was successfully extracted from the ruins of the camera. When someone leaves behind every single item required for modern survival, they are not making a choice to leave. The choice has been made for them. This microscopic digital thread contained a singular frozen frame of video captured in the exact millisecond before the device was obliterated. This image, extracted from the absolute brink of total data destruction, would completely alter the trajectory of the manhunt and expose the terrifying face of the predator who invaded the Catalina Foothills. The sudden influx of digital communication provided a momentary surge of adrenaline for the investigative teams, but it quickly morphed into a chaotic labyrinth of deception. Days after the terrifying breach, a communication surfaced demanding a massive financial payout transferred exclusively through untraceable digital currency networks. The introduction of a cryptocurrency ransom note radically shifted the working theories of the behavioral analysis unit. This was not a localized crime of opportunity or a simple residential burglary gone terribly wrong. The perpetrators were clearly financially motivated, technologically sophisticated, and completely aware of the high-profile connections attached to their target. The national television anchor found herself trapped in an unimaginable psychological torment. The devastating possibility that her public prominence and financial success had essentially painted a bright target on her own mother became a crushing weight. The chilling reality of this specific disappearance is rooted deeply in the terrifying juxtaposition she was forced to grapple with the agonizing thought that her career trajectory had indirectly triggered the most horrific event in her family history. In a desperate attempt to bypass the slow, methodical gears of the legal system and appeal directly to the greed of the captors, the family authorized a private reward fund of exactly $1 million for her safe return. This astronomical sum was deliberately designed to create severe fractures within the criminal enterprise holding her captive. The strategy relied heavily on the psychological pressure of a massive payout, tempting a lower-level accomplice to betray the primary orchestrators for a life-changing sum of money. But the offer of 7 figures also unleashed an absolute torrent of operational interference. The federal tip lines were completely overwhelmed by opportunistic fraudsters, amateur internet sleuths, and individuals attempting to claim the massive reward with fabricated sightings and highly forged digital evidence. Analysts had to painstakingly verify every single phone call, every cryptic email, and every vague geographical coordinate, draining crucial manpower away from the legitimate search efforts. Year-old woman vanished into the desert night without her phone, without her purse, and without her car. Between a quiet, affluent neighborhood and the sudden, violent disruption of a vulnerable life, the entire investigation was drowning in a sea of static. The ransom demand itself presented a deeply maddening contradiction for the profilers. If the operation was highly organized enough to execute a flawless nighttime extraction and navigate the complex logistics of a digital currency extortion plot, why would they risk everything by engaging in a sloppy, violent, physical struggle at the main entryway? The conflicting levels of sophistication suggested a terrifying, compartmentalized scenario. Perhaps the individuals who executed the physical abduction were merely contracted muscle, while the masterminds directing the digital extortion were operating from a completely different location, entirely insulated from the physical violence. This theory expanded the geographical scope of the manhunt exponentially. They were no longer just looking for a single vehicle hidden in the desert. They were hunting a ghost in the global machine. To grasp how a coordinated extraction happens, we first need to examine the specific vulnerabilities that made this location a perfect hunting ground. The federal agents worked frantically around the clock, tracking the digital footprint of the extortion email routing through various anonymous proxy servers and heavily encrypted networks across multiple international borders. Each subsequent dead end severely amplified the collective despair of the command center. The massive private reward sat completely untouched, an agonizing testament to the absolute control the captors maintained over the entire situation. The subsequent silence from the perpetrators was absolutely deafening. They did not provide a reliable proof of life to the family. They did not offer a secondary channel of communication to negotiate logistics. They simply dropped the heavy demand into the digital void and waited patiently. This calculated psychological warfare indicated a level of emotional detachment that deeply alarmed the most seasoned federal profilers. The individuals responsible clearly viewed human life strictly as a highly monetized physical asset. An 84-year-old woman living alone requires a specific ecosystem of routine and predictability. The longer the crushing silence stretched, the more the investigative teams began to quietly fear the absolute worst. The initial desperate hope of a swift, negotiated release was slowly being replaced by the grim realization that the physical condition of the hostage might have deteriorated rapidly. The profound lack of proof of life heavily suggested that the captors might no longer have a living person to leverage for the financial payout. Yet without recovering a body, the case remained trapped in a terrifying state of permanent limbo. The national media coverage intensified broadcasting the desperate pleas of the family and the staggering reward amount across every major television network. The intense public spotlight was a devastating double-edged sword. While it guaranteed that millions of citizens were actively looking for clues, it also forced the perpetrators to burrow significantly deeper underground, making any potential transfer or movement of the hostage incredibly risky for their operation. The tactical advantage of the massive monetary reward was completely neutralized by the sheer logistical terror of navigating the immense public scrutiny. To maintain her independence, and this ecosystem was fully established in her daily life. The investigators were trapped in a desperately reactive posture, waiting for the highly disciplined suspects to make a single careless mistake that would crack the case wide open. Please subscribe to Ronan Cold Cases if you want to follow the absolute truth behind these complex investigations. The official release of the recovered visual data from the lead federal agency shattered the agonizing stagnation of the case and sent a profound shockwave through the public consciousness. The microscopic fragment of surviving memory yielded a single nightmarish image that definitively answered the terrifying question of who had crossed the threshold of that secluded home. The reconstructed frame displayed a highly coordinated, alleged suspect fully prepared for an offensive operation. The individual was heavily armed, heavily masked, and dressed entirely in dark, non-reflective clothing designed to blend into the shadows of the unlit neighborhood. The most distinct operational detail captured in the brief flash of light was a specific piece of equipment strapped to the back of the suspected attacker. It was an Ozark Trail hiker pack, an item seemingly mundane but critically important for carrying specialized tools or potentially subduing a captive. She relied on a strictly scheduled regimen of heart medication, and her physical mobility was reportedly, this was not a panicked intruder stumbling blindly into a random house. This was a tactical operative executing a precise mission. The visual evidence completely validated the initial theory that the violent destruction of the external surveillance apparatus was a deliberate, calculated measure to enforce total blindness upon the property. But the visual confirmation of an armed assailant was merely the superficial layer of a much deeper and far more terrifying revelation. The digital forensic technicians were not satisfied with simply extracting the final image. They dug ruthlessly into the corrupted background files, the cached metadata, and the hidden system logs that survived deep within the fragmented memory chip. And buried within that invisible digital architecture, they unearthed a secondary timeline that completely recontextualized the entire nature of the crime. The hidden data logs revealed that the specific camera on the front porch had recorded motion events that were never fully uploaded to the cloud but were temporarily stamped onto the internal drive. Limited enough that traversing long distances on foot was completely out of the realm of possibility. These hidden timestamps did not align with the violent breach on the final recorded evening. They traced backward, exposing a deeply disturbing pattern of activity that had occurred 20 full days prior. The deeply buried logs proved definitively that a masked figure had systematically approached the property on the 11th of January, conducting a meticulous trial run in the dead of night. This was the massive, horrifying twist that explained every single unanswerable question from the initial investigation. The reason the perpetrator knew exactly where the blind spots were located, the reason they understood the precise response time of the external sensors, and the reason they moved with such terrifying efficiency was because they had already rehearsed the entire operation on the physical ground. The incident in late January was not a sudden violent inspiration. It was the final devastating act of a prolonged, invisible hunting process. The victim was never simply a random target of an opportunistic crime spree. These physical constraints are crucial because they instantly eliminate the theory of voluntary disappearance or accidental wandering. She had been methodically stalked, surveilled, and intentionally selected weeks before the final physical breach ever occurred. The alleged attacker had stood on her property, studied the exact layout of the entrances, tested the perimeter defenses, and calculated the precise geometry required to avoid detection. This chilling revelation completely reframed the emotional weight of the tragedy. For 20 days, an invisible predator had been orbiting her quiet existence, gathering tactical intelligence while she lived her routine life, completely unaware that a sophisticated snare was being slowly tightened around her home. The trial run on the 11th of January explained the terrifying speed of the final assault. The suspected perpetrator did not need to search for the camera because they already knew exactly where it was mounted. The meticulous preparation allowed them to strike with overwhelming force and vanish before any alarm could be raised. The discovery of this hidden timeline elevated the profile of the alleged suspect to a highly organized predator capable of immense patience and extreme operational discipline. But her life was not entirely defined by isolation. The entire community was forced to grapple with the sickening reality that a person could conduct a full tactical rehearsal completely unnoticed by the surrounding inhabitants. The illusion of safety provided by extreme wealth and geographic isolation was irrevocably shattered. This case forces us to ask terrifying questions about our own vulnerabilities, so make sure you ring the notification bell, because Ronan Cold Cases will never stop pulling back the curtain on these complex predatory behaviors. The forensic confirmation of the extensive pre-surveillance phase fundamentally altered the legal classification of the case, moving it firmly into the territory of a highly premeditated, targeted kidnapping. The federal agents now possessed a timeline, a distinct piece of physical gear, and the terrifying knowledge that the individual they were hunting was capable of executing a flawlessly designed operation. The entire massive investigative apparatus pivoted aggressively away from searching for a random attacker and focused entirely on identifying someone with the specific skill set and the extreme psychological patience required to conduct a 20-day surveillance operation. As the mother of prominent television anchor Savannah Guthrie, she existed adjacent to a world of intense public scrutiny, although as the weeks slowly transitioned into agonizing months, the immense physical presence of the federal tactical units began to inevitably draw down from the harsh desert landscape. The helicopters ceased their constant grid searches, and the mobile command center was quietly dismantled, leaving the isolated property once again wrapped in a heavy, unbearable silence. The highly visible search and rescue phase of the operation had officially concluded, yielding absolutely no physical trace of the missing resident. This transition marked a deeply sorrowful turning point for the local jurisdiction and the federal oversight teams. Without a recovered individual and facing the grim mathematical realities of human survival without critical pharmaceutical support, the investigative framework subtly shifted. The primary objective transitioned toward the complex procedural requirements of a no-body homicide protocol. This specific legal designation is incredibly difficult to navigate because prosecutors must essentially build an airtight circumstantial narrative proving that a fatal event occurred without the most crucial piece of physical evidence. The immense public pressure generated by the media attention and the prominent familial connections ensured that the file would never to be relegated to a forgotten cabinet. But the active pace of the daily manhunt slowed into a methodical, grinding, analytical process. She personally maintained a quietly private existence away from the flashing cameras and the aggressive media cycles of her daughter. The vast influx of initial data had been thoroughly processed, and now the dedicated detectives were left waiting for a careless mistake or a delayed confession that might never actually materialize. In an effort to reignite the stagnant flow of actionable intelligence, the official sanctioned compensation for information leading directly to an arrest and conviction was formally increased to an incredibly specific sum of $202,500. The official fund was meant to act as a permanent standing bounty, a continuous financial lure cast out into the criminal underworld. Yet despite the staggering amount of money attached to the resolution, the case remained trapped in a horrifying state of suspended animation. The unforgiving desert simply refused to surrender its dark secrets. The painful transition to a cold procedural state left the family and the public grappling with an absolute lack of definitive closure. The physical absence of a conclusion is often more psychologically damaging than a tragic confirmation. It forces the human mind to continuously generate endless scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. The engine of her vehicle remained cold inside a locked garage, while her essential daily medications sat perfectly undisturbed on the bathroom counter. This familial connection introduces an immediate and heavy tension into the narrative. The investigators meticulously cataloged every single fragment of circumstantial evidence, building a massive theoretical profile of the suspected attacker. But they still lacked the definitive physical link connecting the meticulously planned operation to a specific identifiable individual. The massive global digital tracking effort regarding the cryptocurrency extortion demand eventually faded into the untraceable void of international proxy networks. The alleged mastermind behind the digital ransom remained entirely insulated from the physical reality of the Arizona crime scene, leaving authorities to wonder if opportunistic cyber criminals had simply hijacked the narrative of a completely separate physical tragedy. The most haunting element of the desperately unresolved investigation remains the incredibly specific piece of physical gear captured by the shattered lens in the final milliseconds before darkness fell. The Ozark Trail Hiker Pack is a mass-produced item sold in thousands of retail locations across the country. But in the strict context of this specific case, it represents the only tangible physical connection to the true identity of the perpetrator. The dark backpack was worn by someone who walked the property weeks in advance, someone who calculated. Was her proximity to fame the catalyst for her sudden vanishing, or was she simply a victim of a random, terrifying opportunity? The precise visual angles of the security system and someone who executed a flawlessly brutal extraction, it is highly probable that the specific backpack was eventually discarded, incinerated, or buried deep within the unforgiving terrain of the isolated Arizona mountainside. But the agonizing possibility remains that the item is still sitting in a dark closet somewhere in the greater Tucson metropolitan area. Someone somewhere sold that bag. Someone saw that bag. And someone currently holds the final missing piece of a complex puzzle that has completely paralyzed an entire community. The case sits entirely frozen, waiting for one single thread to be finally pulled. To truly understand the operational mechanics of this horrific event, we must analyze the specific forensic data through a highly analytical lens. What this case teaches us about the illusion of security is profoundly disturbing and forces a complete reevaluation of how we measure safety. The most critical lesson derived from the hidden system logs is the absolute necessity of recognizing the subtle markers of pre-surveillance. The data confirming a tactical trial run 20 days prior to the extraction provides a terrifying textbook example of how a targeted kidnapping is meticulously structured. The environment she chose for her twilight years provides a significant clue to the nature of the threat. The suspected perpetrator did not use the January 11th incursion to steal property. They used that time exclusively to map the exact geographic dimensions of the blind spots and to calculate the precise operational window available before an automated sensor would trigger a secondary alert. They were strictly measuring the physics of the environment. This case aggressively highlights the extreme vulnerability inherent in profound physical isolation. We often culturally equate massive estates and heavy perimeter walls with absolute invulnerability. However, the geographic separation of the affluent neighborhood actively neutralized the most effective deterrent against complex premeditated operations, which is natural community surveillance. High-end architectural security systems are fundamentally static mathematical barriers that a patient-dedicated predator can eventually reverse engineer. The sheer distance between the properties meant there were zero unpredictable human variables to disrupt the timeline of the alleged attacker. There were no observant neighbors walking late at night and no casual witnesses to introduce chaos into the rehearsed plan. She resided in the Catalina Foothills, a highly affluent and deeply secluded residential enclave nestled against the rugged mountains just north of Tucson, Arizona. The extreme privacy purchased by the residents effectively created a silent, sterile testing ground where a stalker could perfect their intrusion strategy entirely undetected. True security requires a dynamic, unpredictable human element that static technology simply cannot replicate. The massive desert estate stands incredibly quiet today, offering no further answers to the teams of investigators who continue to meticulously hunt for the truth. The dark shadows of the affluent residential enclave remain thick, entirely undisturbed by the frantic search that once consumed the rugged terrain. But the profound silence of that sprawling property does not equate to a total erasure of the horrific events. A highly disciplined predator may possess the calculated ability to sanitize their digital footprint and completely vanish into the vast emptiness of the American Southwest. But the deeply ingrained memory of a violent crime scene never actually lies. The physical scars left upon the entryways and the microscopic fragments buried deep within the shattered camera circuitry will remain permanently preserved in the forensic record, waiting patiently for the one specific, undeniable piece of evidence that will finally align the timeline and identify the phantom holding the answers. Until that critical connection is successfully established, the dark investigation remains painfully unresolved. The geography of the foothills is defined by its intentional lack of urban density. We will see you in the very next detailed briefing from Ronan Cold Cases, where we will meticulously examine a heavily guarded file, proving that sometimes the most damning ironclad evidence is quietly hiding directly inside. The properties are massive, sprawling across acres of desert landscaping with homes set far back from the winding roads. There are very few streetlights by design, preserving the dark desert sky, but consequently creating vast pools of impenetrable darkness across the neighborhood. Neighbors are separated by deep ravines, tall cacti, and heavy stone walls. This specific architectural and geographical layout is highly sought after by those desiring absolute privacy, but it inherently lacks the natural community surveillance found in denser suburbs. There are no pedestrians walking their dogs late at night, no neighbors looking out their front windows. A person who requires daily pharmaceutical support to keep her heart beating does not simply walk across a narrow street and no casual witnesses to notice an unfamiliar vehicle idling in the shadows. The very features that made the Catalina Foothills a luxurious and peaceful sanctuary also made it an absolute nightmare for security. Law enforcement experts note that this type of profound physical isolation creates a tactical vacuum. A predator with patience could park a vehicle down a dark, unlit canyon road hike through the desert scrub and observe a property for hours or even days without ever triggering a single suspicion or encountering a random passerby. The quietness of the desert is not a protective barrier. It is a dense, heavy curtain that swallows sound and conceals movement. Living in such an environment requires a profound trust in physical security measures like solid wood doors, heavy deadbolts, and electronic surveillance systems. But when a resident is physically frail and the nearest neighbor is essentially out of earshot, all the deadbolts in the world cannot stop a threat that has already bypassed the perimeter. Out of a fortified home into the freezing darkness of an Arizona winter on her own volition. The absolute silence of the Catalina Foothills was not providing safety. It was merely providing the perfect, undisturbed stage for an observer to learn her routines, map her property, and wait for the exact right moment to strike. We must understand that true vulnerability is often masked by the appearance of luxury and exclusivity. The expensive zip code and the beautifully landscaped desert terrain offered an illusion of invulnerability. But in reality, every sprawling acre of that property was just another blind spot where someone could wait in the freezing desert night, watching the lights turn off inside the house one by one. The timeline of the 31st of January 2026 began as a completely unremarkable Saturday, built entirely on expected routines. According to documented timelines provided by investigators, the 84-year-old resident returned to her Catalina Foothills property at precisely 9:50 in the evening. This timestamp is incredibly important because it establishes a firm baseline for the beginning of the threat window. The heavy garage door closed, securing her vehicle inside the structure and effectively sealing her within the assumed safety of her home. Law enforcement officials immediately recognized that the disturbing physical evidence recovered from the immediate vicinity. There were no reported frantic phone calls to family members that night, no triggering of panic alarms, and no unusual digital footprint that would suggest she felt she was being followed or monitored on her drive back to the residence. The transition from the exterior world to the interior sanctuary was by all measurable accounts completely normal. But the heavy quiet of that Saturday night slowly bled into a deeply unsettling Sunday morning. Her family expected her to participate in an online church service, a consistent and cherished weekly routine that she rarely missed without prior notification. When the digital service began and she failed to log in, the initial reaction was likely mild concern. Perhaps there was a technological glitch, a forgotten password, or a simple decision to sleep in. But as the morning hours stretched toward noon and multiple phone calls rang unanswered, the mild concern rapidly crystallized into severe anxiety. An 84-year-old woman with a heart condition who suddenly breaks her communication patterns presents an immediate red flag. Family members swiftly made the decision to physically check on the property. Of the property, told a story, not of a confused senior citizen wandering off, but of a precise and devastating intrusion. When they arrived at the quiet estate, they were met with a profound and heavy silence. The exterior of the home offered no immediate visual screams of chaos. Her vehicle remained securely parked in its designated spot inside the closed garage. The physical presence of the car is a devastating piece of factual evidence. It definitively proved she had not experienced a sudden medical emergency while driving, and she had not decided to take a spontaneous trip. Peering through the windows and eventually gaining access to the interior, the family discovered a scene frozen in time. Her purse containing her identification and credit cards sat undisturbed. Her mobile phone, the vital tether to her family and emergency services, was left behind. The crucial daily medications required to regulate her heart rhythm were still waiting to be taken. Every single item required to navigate the outside world safely was abandoned inside the structure. The question that has kept investigators awake is not where she went, but who possesses the absolute audacity to extract a human being from a high security. The realization that washed over the family and soon the first responding officers was cold and absolute. She did not walk away into the sprawling Arizona desert. She did not drive away to seek medical attention. The secure perimeter of her life had been breached. The threat had not intercepted her out in the unpredictable public sphere. The threat had patiently waited for her to return to her ultimate safe zone, and then the threat had directly crossed her threshold The house was no longer a home. It had instantly transformed into a container holding the echoes of a sudden and completely unexplained extraction. The pristine condition of her personal belongings contrasted violently with her physical absence, demanding an answer to a terrifying question. Who possesses the terrifying capability to enter a secured residence, neutralize an occupant without triggering a massive neighborhood disturbance, and evaporate into the desert night carrying an 84-year-old woman? Residents and what exactly the digital eye of that front porch Ring camera managed to capture in its final milliseconds before it was violently dismantled. The absence of a chaotic struggle inside the primary living spaces indicated a deeply chilling reality. The suspected perpetrator was not a panicked burglar surprised by a homeowner. The suspected perpetrator was efficient, organized, and completely focused on the primary objective. The quietness of the morning discovery was the most alarming detail of all, because it meant the violent disruption of her life had been executed with a terrifying level of control and precision. The initial responding deputies from the Pima County Sheriff Department immediately recognized the gravity of the silent house. They knew instinctively that they were standing at the epicenter of a highly calculated event that defied every single standard parameter of a typical missing persons case. The initial visual assessment of a pristine interior was aggressively shattered the moment investigators began a meticulous inch-by-inch forensic sweep of the property exterior. The back door, heavily secured against the desert elements, showed undeniable signs of being forcefully pried open. The metal framing was scarred and the locking mechanism was compromised, indicating a deliberate and determined physical breach of the structural perimeter.